Welcome back to All Therapists Are Jerks with Ulland
and Jo.
In this episode, we're talking about suffering and more specifically the Four Noble Truths and how they come about. Often when working with families, I think it can be important to try to reverse a process that happens in the family, but happens in many systems. There's a tendency for people who have emotional reactivity to experience negative emotions, and our culture doesn't often leave us enough room to have negative emotions, because what happens is we either don't want to hear it or we want to move out of it right away, or we want to provide reassurance to move forward because we don't really want to hold that tension. The problem is that the individual who's emotionally sensitive actually needs that. They need to be able to express emotion accurately, have that accepted before moving forward, and that takes time. So for me, I view that process as like a negative space. Like we have to increase the negative space in the family to undo the invalidating environment's tendency to not give enough space for negative emotion. I tend to be a bit of a reductionist at times, and also, so I like to get down to the simplest model that still seems to be truthful. And also I like to have kind of a complete picture, so I often will chronologically want to go back like to the beginning. So please excuse me and indulge me in doing this. Some of this talk today isn't, directly out of DBT necessarily, but comes out of evolutionary psychology, which is a field I think is fascinating. The idea that we're here today because our ancestors were successful. So whatever they had to endure or put up with, that can get passed to us and does get passed to us through genetics. So, and this even includes behavior, traits of personality and things like that. So all of us here listening to this podcast, we're all, here because our ancestors were successful. If we look back at our history, over 100,000 years of our history is really hunter-gatherers, which still exist on the planet today, but that's a very different life than the life that we're familiar with. And really, since the Industrial Revolution in particular, things have been just exploding with knowledge and technology and the scientific method, so that life really doesn't look the same at all. We're kind of like cavemen and women in modern society. So one of the ways I like to start the conversation is talk about this thing called the law of twos. Now, I don't know, this isn't really a biological law or a biological principle necessarily, but it's a pattern that's often seen. And the pattern has to do with the idea that multiple different types of species, from even something as different as like some bacteria, but also oak trees and humans, have this pattern that happens, which is seen more in hunter-gatherer societies than our society today. And so what the pattern is that if you were to say that an individual couple were to have 10 children, 6 of those children would die before they became teenagers, probably through infection or accident or illness. Out of the 4 that are remaining, 2 more of those children would die before procreating. So what happens is, in ancient times, or much of human lived history, in family systems, you had 2 children of 10 would provide you with grandchildren. So what that really meant, because we didn't have birth control, was what it really implied was that you were going to lose 80% of your children. And to a male, that might be difficult too, because actually you would often lose the mother of the children too. So to try to, which is horrifying for women historically, but also for males, is that to have a long-term mate, really biologically, it wasn't in the cards. And you would witness this massive amount of suffering in your neighbors and everyone in your tribe, and actually everyone in your tribe was a relative anyways. So you're watching people related to you and loved ones dying like all of the time. This is where we come from. Mother Nature doesn't really care about us. We have to adapt to it and successfully do so, and that's why we're here today. This kind of brings us to the idea of, to me, to connect it to what Marsha Linehan is working on with DBT, is the idea of how important emotions are. So emotions had evolved for survival and served some important functions. Many of the probably more survival-related emotions are probably felt stronger in the body. And for me, I think one of the good examples is disgust. So disgust actually originates historically as basically infection. It's a response to the possibility of being infected. An infection, we didn't have antibiotics or vaccinations, so infections could wipe out you and your entire family. So if someone was unclean, so to speak, then you would have a sense of disgust and you would avoid them. And that's such an important, powerful response that someone can intellectually disgust you. Someone could say something against your values, and there's no fear of physical infection, but their thought is so perverse or so different from your own that actually you have this fear of contamination of an idea even, which often like that is still relevant to like religion and belief as well. And so a lot of the more hardwired emotions that we have are really actually negatively experienced because they're about survival. Emotions that would be in the Linehan Skills Manual would be ones that have the most evidence as being a pure emotion and kind of looked at as emotions that have multiple cultural words for the same emotion, but also events that would lead to emotion, the thoughts you would have, physical sensations of the emotion, behaviors often seen, urges you would have, consequences and after effects. So emotions are behaviors because there's a whole sequence of events that occurs, which we'll likely talk about in another podcast. 8 of the 10 emotions in the manual are negatively experienced. So to list them off would be disgust, fear, anger, sadness, jealousy, envy, guilt, and shame. These are not emotions that any one of us really want to experience, and we'd rather not. And much of them are there because they kept our ancestors alive. There are 2 positive emotions, which are love and joy, which are things that all of us would like to experience. I hadn't really thought about this before, but if you think of like only 2 children survive to bring you offspring out of 10, we only have 2 emotions out of 10 that actually are positively experienced. So there's this asymmetry to being human that we often don't think about, which is interesting because our societies often seems to be moving towards a place of convenience and not suffering losses and avoidance of losses and not grieving losses. So we're trying to build a society that runs headlong against the universe, because the universe don't care and things happen how they happen. But then also we're protecting ourselves from experiencing suffering, which might make it more difficult to suffer when we have to and there's no way to avoid it.
Right, I like to think of this as like the pursuit of happiness, right? So that's one of my favorite things when parents come in to treatment with their kids, and they say, well, what are your goals for treatment with your kid? Well, I just want her to be happy. And I was like, ooh, yeah. So, we have to bring them back to this concept that like life actually has suffering. Life is suffering. We're built for suffering. So the goal of your kid being happy, that actually can't happen without experiencing the suffering. So right. The goal would be more of being able to tolerate and accept the suffering.
Right. And you said before, and I like the kind of quote you have, is like, we're not here to get you feeling better. We're here to get you better at feeling. Mm-hmm. No matter what those feelings might be.
Whatever the emotion is, yeah.
Which is somewhat paradoxical because we like to believe it'd be nice if we could work with individuals and get them like linearly better. Like every day we're notching it up. We're going in that direction of feeling better. And yet emotional suffering can be like a 3rd-degree burn where you have to debride the tissue. Mm-hmm. And that's like probably one of the worst jobs to ever have is be the clinician that has to come in to remove dead tissue off a burn because that's extraordinarily painful for the patient. Right. You actually have to generate a lot of pain in order to protect them and keep them safe. And sometimes in therapy, it feels the same way, that it's not like you're being mean to a patient, is not what I mean, but you're asking them to do things that they've been avoiding and found difficult to do, and they're going to hurt more doing it, but they have to do that to recover.
Right. Well, and I think the other part of the asymmetry that you're talking about too is, so those 8 emotions that we needed from an evolutionary standpoint, we actually need them less now because of modern conveniences, because the prefrontal cortex and, yes. We would talk a lot about the amygdala and the fight, flight, and freeze response and how we have fewer things to actually be afraid of than we ever have before.
Right. And laws like envy and jealousy, because we have a legal system and,
right.
like capitalism kind of idea, like we don't really need those as much either.
Right. And yet our bodies are still hardwired to experience them, and we try to create things around us and form our environment to not experience these emotions, and yet we still do. Like, I like the example that you give with Starbucks. Like, you can order your half paragraph Starbucks, and we're a world of convenience. Yeah. And yet, so like, you come in, and I actually observe this happen often. You come in, and then someone's food is wrong, or like their drink is wrong, and they get irate. Yeah. And it's like, wow, does that really fit the facts of the situation? So your body still fires all of these intense emotions that helped us survive, but now we like channel them toward my Starbucks drink is wrong.
Yeah. Well, I remember at the time too, like the convenience thing. I think about childhood, like when I was really little, we used to eat it like McDonald's, but they always had those like diced onions on the burgers. And as a child, I just hated onions. So and I would ask them, could you please not put the onions on? But you would always get the onions on. Like rarely ever did they do that. And I still remember when Burger King came out with this have it your way. And it was like this mind blowing, like, you mean I could order the burger with like what I don't want on it or what I want on it? I was like, that's amazing. But like, why is that? That was like an invention. Somebody had an idea for that, that actually you don't have to have it the way that we say it should be as a restaurant. We're going to start catering to what you actually want. And now it's gone so far, like I think at Starbucks, you can kind of order almost like the temperature of the drink. Yeah. Like that, to me, that's just like, it's crazy.
Extra hot.
Right. And now order it from your phone so you don't have to talk to anybody. Like all of us introverts with social anxiety are like, oh, thank God I don't have to talk to anyone. I feel awkward. I can just order it through my computer, and go get it. So I think that's a very different time we live in.
Yeah, so like our fear, right? That's another one. Like the fear, now we fear rejection, whereas before we fear that we were going to be like murdered or eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or something.
Right. Yeah, it's just a different world. Now we're so fearful of what people think of us, and that was less of a fear back in the day. I mean, it mattered,
right?
But just being alive tomorrow was more. It was
way more important. Yeah,
we're not being murdered. That's another one.
Well, I mean, depending where you live, that's a thing.
Yes, still.
Yeah.
So there's this asymmetry that we talked about, like actually of the emotions, there are more negative emotions and positive emotions. There's another asymmetry on top of this, which is actually how intense the experience of emotions are. So you can, if you like kind of drew a diagram and it was like a plot between, on the left side, you'd think of the like measured like negative event, like how negative was that event for a human. And then on the right side of the graph would be like a positive event happening to you, and like the most positive thing, like, oh, I found $1 on the sidewalk, or like I won $1 million, like those types of events. And then, towards the y-axis, on the vertical axis, you would be looking at like the intensity of the experience, like the valence of the emotion, like how much would you feel? So what the graph looks like on the upper right quadrant would be like a logarithmic curve, which kind of goes through the center of the cross and then kind of levels out to kind of a maximum amount. And then on the lower left quadrant, you would have another logarithmic curve. So it would kind of look almost like a propeller, a curvy propeller, so to speak. But it wouldn't be symmetrical. So if you rotated the graph, the two sides past each axis basically don't look the same. They're a similar shape, but they're different amplitudes. So what it means is that if I have a negative event happen and an equally positive event, I actually experience the negative effect more profoundly than the positive.
So to use your money example, if I lost $10, right, that would be way more negative than if I had found $10.
Well, way more negative, right? But also like the positive effect would not nearly affect you as much.
Right.
Right, that idea. And so that's...
so I'd experience more negativity losing $10 than I would positivity finding $10.
Yes, which I forget to talk about sometimes. So like what that means, this is why humans are loss averse. So that this is our tendencies, that we're averse of loss. We're built that way because loss hurts more than gain does. So and if you think about it, evolutionarily speaking, gain, if you ever had gain, it was going to be like savory foods, sweet foods, hard to find, right? Mm-hmm. Love, sex, like these things were like gains that actually helped us survive better. But they weren't directly related to our extinction. So they probably came later, like love and joy came a bit later in evolution most likely, but they're the things that drive us to build communities, to love, to protect each other. Prefrontal cortex, like you talked about earlier, they're kind of like the fuel for that of no longer being an individual. Like humans aren't great. Like Homo sapiens, we're horrible at being individuals, actually. Mm-hmm. Our benefit is we have the most complex social structure of any primate, and love and joy help us maintain that. The other negative emotions that are there for survival actually can increase conflict in relationships where they're not actually helpful. That's not necessarily where they evolved from.
Right.
So I think that's what we run into, where in the modern times we see caveman and women behavior, and you're like, oh, but why is that happening today? Because it's hardwired in there. It's like bad. Sort of like I think of like the mind is a lot like, I got to do general training in Dartmouth, and I've been since I went to college at different parts of the country, but I really thought going to Dartmouth would be fun, and not because it was Dartmouth. It wasn't really that. It was like I wanted to be in New England. Since I was a kid, I saw postcards. I was like, oh my God, like Cape Cod houses and like trees changing color and like the rocks. Like it just seemed like this place I wanted to live. And so when I got there, one of the things I liked was could drive on a country road in the middle of nowhere and you see this nice Cape house that's single story and has like the door in the center and 2 windows on the side. And there's a big barn out back with maybe silos or something like on a farm. And you're like, oh, you know how far back that is from the house. And you're around the corner and you realize that the house is connected to the barn because it's like another building, another building, another building, another building. So as the family and the farm got larger, the building continued to expand. And I had my friend Jeff, they were house shopping out there when he was in training, and they went to this house they called the House of Doors. So they had gone to this house to look at it, and like they have the regular size house, and then you'd open a door, go into another part of the house, you'd walk through a bedroom to another door. It's like door after door that shouldn't be there, but you're walking to each new segment of the house. Or if anyone ever gets a chance to go to Vermont and go to Norwich, there's a place called Dan and Wits, and I hope it's still open. And that's when we toured out there, the chair, Ron Green at the time, he's a great psychiatrist and really wonderful person and kind of like lived his whole life there, which is really cool. But he took us to Dan and Wits. And so it's like, it looks like a convenience store kind of, and you walk into it and you expect it to be like small, like a convenience store. But then there's a weird door where in most convenience stores it'd be like, oh, that's where staff go, but it wasn't. So you go into it and all of a sudden you're like in a section that was like mechanical parts. And then you'd say, oh, that's interesting. But there'd be another door. You go, and is that the staff door? No, you go into that one. And it was all like lawn care stuff. And just like 3 or 4 times, you're like walking through a neighborhood block in one store. It was actually almost like, felt like a little tiny Home Depot, but it was insane. That's kind of the way the brain is. Like each generation doesn't redesign the building entirely. The brain is evolved by just tagging on more parts on bad hardwiring.
I'm so glad you explained where you were going with this. I'm like, how did we get to
we
doors
get this far, like,
and New England and like?
I had to talk about Dan and Wits because that was just like that was great. So if you're Norwich, Vermont,
no, but it totally makes sense
there.
now. Like what you're saying, it's like you don't like tear down the whole building and start fresh and just keep the external structure. You just tack on.
Right. So it's really no question why humans still do primitive things because we lose sense of our history, right? So you see somebody do something like, oh my God, why would you ever do that? Yeah, because they were in a context that reminded their brain of a time in our culture where that was a life-threatening or a possible loss that would have been basically a loss that would have ended someone's life, and they do this reaction. And you're like, why would you do that? Why would you just call the police? Or why wouldn't you? Well, because in that context, the brain was surviving.
Right.
And I think that's, unfortunate to find yourself in this context. But that would be a conversation, for another day. I'm kind of getting off task.
Well, no, because now it prompts another thought in me. So
Sure.
This is what happens.
Sure.
So for me, I start thinking that we're constantly fighting our biology.
Yeah.
So it's almost like our cognitions fight our biology.
Right.
All right. Sorry. Maybe everybody else in the world knew that, but I just made the connection.
No, but I think it's important. And then in a biological sense, that's your frontal lobe fighting with your limbic system.
Yeah.
Which is the same thing in DBT, right? Short-term, long-term consequences.
Right. Yeah.
My limbic system, or anyone's, evolved for like right now in this moment I have to make this decision for me. Those were the decisions.
Right. To survive.
But now we have this Leviathan, and the Leviathan represents like a police force, legal, military, capitalism, like these higher ideal concepts that actually help us to be super cooperators, which we're really good at. But we've built executive functioning outside of our executive functioning. So the idea of the frontal lobe is saying, hey, I don't really want to study for this test and I don't want to hang out with my friends, but then I'll fail the test tomorrow. So it's actually harder to do the test today or study for the test today. But if I do, that's better for my future, but harder to do, right? It's a short game, long game, I call it. Well, we've built a society that actually builds an additional structure to that makes it more stable so that you can have even a longer game, like retirement.
Right.
Like retirement's a crazy idea to a human being. Because like we existed most time, you're lucky to get your next meal, lucky to get a mate, lucky not to lose all your children. Like it was just like you were going to lose everything all the time.
Well, yeah, we were dead by 40.
Oh, totally. Yeah. If
hard to
like,
believe we'd be dead now already.
Like if I took a time machine back then, I'd be like a demigod. They'd look at me with my gray hair and a beard, and oh my God, you're so old. And I'm like, I'm not even close to retirement,
Yeah.
But we have this game where we're even like upset because the government will like inheritance taxes, right? Like I building up whatever I can for my children to send them to a good school, and then if there's anything left after I go, I want that to go to them. That's a weird idea, new to humans actually. But so we built these other structures that are organizing on top of our executive functioning. So it's really interesting how things become meta and above.
Right.
Anyways,
well, no wonder they get so complicated.
Yes.
Moving on.
Good
tangent.
Right. So we go back to this asymmetry that we have more negative emotions than positive emotions, and we experience negative emotions more profoundly than positive. So as Joe said, we are hardwired for suffering.
Which leads beautifully into...
Well, so the Four Noble Truths. these ideas, come out of Zen philosophy, and they've been stumbled upon even in Western philosophy, but I do kind of like the Eastern way of looking at it. So the Four Noble Truths were a way of trying to come to terms with the level of suffering humans experienced. And these are, thousands of years old ideas. So the first noble truth is that life is suffering. And I say that as a quote, like life is suffering, which is quite depressing. And to present this to families is difficult too, because they're here and they have been suffering, their daughter's been suffering, and our first conversation is not about making their kids feel better. Because what we're trying to do is to talk about this hardwiring of negativity, because this is the reality. And this is the thing that we've been avoiding in our culture and also within the families. And that avoidance of it has actually worsened their daughter's illness or son's illness.
Right. And I think that, the way that we conceptualize this, or the way it kind of rolls out in what we do at work, is we start off with this to introduce the concept of radical acceptance. So even though technically this isn't DBT, it is the driving force behind why we even do radical acceptance, right? Mm-hmm. So we introduce it like this, which is like a big downer most of the time. The parents are all hopeful, and they're so excited for their kids to change and for their families to change, or things to get better. And we're and life is suffering. Mm-hmm. It's a buzzkill.
And a total buzzkill. It's the hardest. These are the hardest parent universities to give. What I like about life is suffering is it's just this ultimate acceptance stance. It's let's not try to pretend it's something different. Let's recognize what actually is kind of objectively real, but suffering also has a subjective feel to it. But there's going to be pain, there's going to be difficulty, there's going to be conflict. Mother Nature really doesn't care about us. We've had to adapt to it our entire lived history as a species. So it's just saying what it is. Life is suffering, which I do think is helpful too for compassion, to be honest. So you could be having the best week ever and you're excited and super happy, but if you also are mindful of the fact that life is suffering, that you may not be experiencing that currently, but many people around you are, and probably most people around you are suffering in some way.
Well, and I think, so that actually makes me think about the loving kindness, right? So loving kindness, DBT skill, but also loving kindness, the meditation. If we believe that life is suffering, then when we are sending loving kindness, may you be happy, may you be healthy, those types of things. It's may your suffering reduce. Mm-hmm. That is a very compassionate, empathetic thing that helps us reduce our own suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So if we have to suffer, then, might there be value in suffering? So one of the things that suffering might be helpful for is the fact that our mind actually doesn't do objective measurements well. So most of our systems actually have to do with comparison. So I know the temperature of a room is either hot or cold. I don't know. I can't say, it's 72 degrees in here. I couldn't cognitively know that. That would be a lucky guess. But I would know that the room feels cold or warm to me, and that would be based on prior experience of me being in the previous room or what I'm typically used to feeling in a room. So we have to have contrast. So what that means is we have to have pretty shitty days to have good days. Mm-hmm. So if I could live the most perfect day of my life every day, that would actually be horrible. It would be a nightmare. Because I would be bored. Mm-hmm. I'd be disinterested. I wouldn't know I was having a good day because my mind would reset to an average day.
Yeah, it becomes your new baseline.
Yeah, your new baseline. Like the hedonist treadmill, which could be, a whole hour conversation in and of itself. But I have to have my worst days ever to let me know when I'm having a good day. And actually I like that contrast idea too with when they put salt on fancy chocolate. Mm-hmm. I'm not really a chocolatier or whatever, or foodie.
Foodie at all.
No. But the idea, I tried it one time, I was what's fancy candy like? And it had salt on caramel, and I bit into it, it was getting punched in the mouth with salt water, from the sea. And I was oh my God, why would you do that? And then immediately, it's the sweetest chocolate I've ever had. It's just a total trick. Assault my tongue with saltiness, and then it could be mediocre chocolate, but it just tastes like the sweetest ever.
I like to think of it as a dialectical delight.
Okay. Okay. I do have to accept your idea. You are correct. It is a dialectical delight. One I was not prepared for. Sort of when you grab a drink and you think it's a soda, but it's water. And you're oh my God.
Yeah.
It's just water. Same thing.
Oh my God, that tastes horrible. Oh wait, I drink it all the time. I was expecting Sprite.
Sprite. Yeah. It's a similar idea. So pain and suffering and stress also are helpful for growth. So we evolved to it. Good examples are how gravity is with bones. Under a gravitational field, we build bone mass. We need the stress on our bones to produce more bone. And so if you go into space, any of you go into space for any reason, please have oxygen.
Like physically, though.
Yes, that'd be cool. Let me know about it. But like you have to exercise a lot in space because you start losing bone mass nearly immediately. Also, if you lift weights or you want to be stronger for a marathon or just to lift more, to look good, like to build the muscle mass, you actually have to tear down muscle fiber to do it. So humans are anti-fragile, which is interesting because we don't have an antonym to the word fragile. So we just say anti-fragile. The idea that stress makes us stronger or something traumatic can make us stronger or more resilient is such a foreign concept to us that we don't really have a lot of words for it. And I think that's important to realize. And I think some people, we are a result of our lived experience. And there are definitely people out there who probably are stronger for or have more meaning because of the bad things that have happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. Looking for the purpose in the pain, or I like the concept of the mindset,
Mm-hmm.
Being able to take our failures as growth experiences, like how do we become better, versus failures as now we just stop or we regress or we don't continue. So we have to have the failures in order to grow. I think this is a really hard concept for residents because a lot of our residents struggle with a lot of extreme perfectionism.
Right.
So you're highly perfectionistic. That means you can't risk failing. But if you risk failing, or if you don't risk failing, you don't ever
we don't really succeed.
Excel, or succeed. Well, and you're never
slows your
never
learning.
content ever.
Well, you're not content, right? You also slows your learning because we learn fastest by mistakes.
Correct.
The pain you have with mistakes or seeing that it didn't work is informative.
Right.
So when something doesn't work, you're like, oh, that's not going to work. But when things work, you're kind of you don't know if it worked based on luck or not. So you kind of need fail. Oh, who's it? I think Niels Bohr had said something like they called him an expert in his field, like in chemistry. He's like, well, I'm an expert because I've made more mistakes than anyone else in a smallly defined field.
Yeah.
To paraphrase him.
Being a Wisconsin complete dork and Packer fan, that was Brett Favre, right? One of the best quarterbacks of all time, also threw the most interceptions.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah. Also, so suffering brings about learning. So you experience something bad, you just may not do it again. So I like to think about I'm never dating someone like that again, just knowing that type of person wasn't the best fit. The second noble truth then is to really try to look at, where does suffering come from? So the idea in the Eastern thought is that attachment leads to suffering. And it's not so much attachment as a relationship, not caring about people. That is not at all what it means. Attachment is more like rigidity, things have to be a certain way. So my ideas are immovable, I'm attached to particular ideas that I'm not allowing it to change or be different. And I think in the West, I like looking at the idea of expectation is similar, that I have expectations for the way things should be. Expectations are ideals. So often it's it's the best version of what could happen or what you'd want to have happen. And that automatically leads to comparison. Because if I have an expectation for something to happen, I have to then compare my expectation with the reality of what occurs or the reality of what occurred if I'm thinking, in the past.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be a gap.
And this one ticks parents off a lot and actually surprises the girls too.
Yeah.
When you start talking about lowering your expectations, they're like, oh, so we shouldn't expect them to do anything?
Right, which is an expectation.
Which is still an expectation.
I've had residents all do oh yeah, so I shouldn't really want to do well. Yeah, but that's still an expectation of not doing well.
Mm-hmm.
It's so the negative expectation is still an expectation.
Well, it's an attachment to how you think life should be rather than accepting life as it is, or so it's not a replacement for goals. I think that's really important. Parents think that, or even the girls will think that, well, if I lower my expectations, I'll never achieve anything.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, right. And so I think and often having high expectations doesn't lead to success. It actually can set someone up for failure. Mm-hmm. So it's really just having goals and practically working towards them is the most important thing. When you add expectations, you also add a fair amount of shame. And the idea of should, I should have done better. I should have, my mom shouldn't have said that to me, or, these kinds of things. Well, you may think that way, and at the same time, you have what you have. You have that grade. You had that conversation. Whether it should or shouldn't have happened, that's the story in your own mind. It happened the way that it did.
Well, and that goes to one of the agreements, too, or assumptions, I should say, is, everybody's doing the best they can in any given moment in time, and everyone's capable of doing better. If we're looking back and say, I should have done better, or I could have done better, it's well, could you have really? In that moment in time, that was probably the best that you could do with the knowledge, with your level of dysregulation, you know? So I think letting go of, you know, I guess for me, we do a lot of this work as residents are getting ready to discharge the program. We tell the parents, like, you know what, there is a possibility, there's a likelihood that they might relapse into ineffective behaviors. You can't expect them to never make a mistake again, you know, because if you're expecting that, you're definitely going down the wrong path.
Right. What's hard about it is the residents already expect it of themselves often. But they know they can't. And parents may not have set that expectation up. Often that's not the case, but just unconsciously through behaviorism is that a lot of individuals we work with, like, they've developed these expectations that have been inadvertently communicated also by family or been reinforced. So the residents themselves actually can't tolerate failure, and so often give up and stop trying because they can't be perfect the way I do it, or what's the point, or, you know, those things.
You get back into that all or nothing black and white thinking.
Yeah. If then expectation, you know, like Joe said earlier, so if expectations lead to suffering and we'd like to minimize our suffering, which makes sense, I think people would agree with that, like suffering isn't really great. So if we lower our expectations, then we lower our suffering. And when I talk with parents often, when I make that statement aloud, that I tell their daughters actually that they should lower their expectations. I do it. I'm fishing them in a little bit. I admit that. But the room gets very silent at that point. It's like what parents hear me saying initially is that your children aren't capable because of their mental illness. And that's not at all what I'm saying. So it really grabs their attention. And then we have a conversation about the fact that your daughters have great goals. As long as they line up with like what they value in life and what they want to have capability in, and that they want to work for that, that's wonderful, no matter what that is. The expectation is they have to do it a certain way. Do I have to go to the Ivy League school? Do I have to have the 4.0? And you'll see this too, like some are very focused on having a 4.0 where it's like they want almost like medical school or veterinary school criteria to move on to a field like art school, where I think it's more about like what you produce and your unique personality in the interview process. I don't know that that's about like your GPA, you know what I mean? But that level of perfection has to be this way. The only way to do it is to do it this way. Right.
Well, honors classes, AP classes, like you're actually trying to get a 5.0 on a 4-point scale.
Right. And which I was of the idea of like, oh, I got 120%. Well, that really just tells me that your teacher doesn't understand math.
Yeah, right.
Can't really do that. So if we want to lower expectations, lower our suffering, we have to give up on the shoulds. Less shoulds in our mind, because that's a red flag for comparison and evaluation. Giving up perfectionism, like you had said, Joe. Also, the shift has to happen, which is hard in our culture, is to shift away from the outcome of what we do to just the process.
Right.
A good example of this is well known, has been established that like first generation Asian Americans often do quite well in school. They do outperform other demographics, so to speak. And it's not because of IQ. So, you know, their average IQ is not any higher than the average IQ of other Americans. So it's not based on raw cognitive ability. And so, you know, they've done research to find out, you know, what is this? Why is this? You know, how are the parents? And, you know, tiger moms or whatever. That's really actually hasn't turned out to be the reason why. What they've seemed to isolate it down to is actually how each demographic really talks to their children. The tendency for the average American family, not the average is the actual, you know, but the response might be, you know, you didn't do well on a test. Well, you're smart. You'll do well next time. So you kind of like it's not really a valid explanation if you think about it. Like, you're just intelligent, right? Fixed trait. If you do well on a test, well, of course you did. You know, you're smart.
Right.
So it's like you focus on the outcome, but also a static trait.
Or in my family, you got lucky.
Yeah, lucky. It's like, ouch. Like, come on. And then what you find in first generation Asian American families, which is interesting because by the third generation, they actually lose this effect and their children aren't actually doing any better than the average anymore. And they've also tied it to the same thing, is that they start sounding like the average American family when it comes to performance. But the first generation family, if you do well on a test, of course you did well on a test, you worked hard. If you don't do well on a test, the explanation is you didn't work hard enough. So there's a direct relationship between effort to outcome. Not all focused on the outcome, like the Asian parents could say, you have to have A's, you know, like just or all else is lost. No, the A's come out of the effort you put in.
Right.
So they're highly reinforcing of effort. And so practically what you find out is Asian American students typically spend 1.5 times the amount of time before giving up. I like thinking about math because math is so straightforward. You're right or wrong kind of thing. And I did engineering, so it's kind of this pattern. It's like you would, in math, you just get these standard math problems to practice. But then on your homework, the last 2 questions often were stretchers. they would kind of pull you into the next topic you would hit in the next chapter, try to get you to think a little differently, a little harder. So they were harder. But then if you think like at 10 minutes, I'd give up on a math assignment, I can't figure out the problem. I'll just leave it till someone else figures it out for me, or I talk about it tomorrow, is I might spend 10 minutes as the average American kid, but like an Asian American will spend 15 minutes. But the thing is, they don't give you 20-minute problems on homework.
Mm-hmm.
The last two problems are probably more like 13, 15-minute problems, so to speak. So if I quit too early to figure it out, I lose that learning opportunity of having figured it out myself.
Mm-hmm.
So over time and time again in different subjects, as an individual who just spends more time working at it, will get there because some of learning is through effort, not just raw intelligence.
Right, which I think actually goes to the skills building mastery.
Right.
You know, so if you bring it back around to skills, like that's where building mastery comes from. It's effort, it's repetition.
Oh, yeah.
So
it's just like knowing what the skill is just doesn't get you anywhere.
Right. And I think that there's sometimes where people are born with some natural talents. Like some people can carry a tune very young. Some people will never carry a tune no matter how many voice lessons they have. So there's some natural raw talent. But I think, and you actually kind of said this the other day at one of our presentations, you'd made the comment that like, oh, you watch some of these shows, like, you know, the reality TV shows, and it just looks like, oh my gosh, they were just born with this like amazing voice because
right.
That's how like the package shows it, right? But
mm-hmm.
that you don't really realize that there's like hours upon hours of voice lessons,
yes.
or hours upon hours of failures, you know, especially with the comedians, I think. Like
oh my
the
God,
comedians
yeah.
are almost always older.
Yeah.
Because they've had so many failures before they're actually funny.
Yeah, it's hard to be funny because over and over again, they learn what's not funny. Like the whole job
right.
being a comedian is being shown over and over again that you're not funny.
Right.
And what remains is funny.
Right.
But you got to get rid of all the chaff with that. And it's got to be emotionally very painful.
Exactly.
And I like hearing Seinfeld talk about it kind of, and he has this, you know, comedians in cars with coffee, and like they're just fascinating. But like how they view sitcoms as a stand-up comedian, how they view it, how they get to what they get to. You don't have like 15 people in a room writing something for like a sitcom.
Mm-hmm.
They need that many people to make it funny. When you're a comedian, it's just you, and the audience is going to tell you when you're not funny, and that's got to be deeply painful. And even when you're an experienced comedian, you're still going to say stuff that just doesn't work.
Right.
And then it's just reworking and how painful that is. But that's where the expertise comes from.
Well, and I think that those shows then they don't fully depict the hours upon hours of practice and the hours and hours of failures that
right.
come. It's just like, oh, you know, they've been singing since they were 4. They're just naturally gifted and talented. Like, well, yeah, you could be naturally gifted and talented, but if you don't practice and you don't sing, like it's not going to matter.
Well, I almost kind of feel like, and I'm not like the best historian, so if I say anything that's politically minded, you know, just don't bother leaving a comment. I know. I get it. But like, I always feel like there's almost something like deeply un-American about that idea of being born with it. Because like, according to the founding fathers, like, hey, land of opportunity, come here, work hard, like your effort will determine your success. And then it seems like today we just want to believe that there are these little kids that are born that are like prodigies. Like, and there's some that like they're prodigious, and they're doing, part of the reason they're prodigious is they're probably reasonably bright, but they're obsessed with the thing that they're doing.
Right.
Like if they're a cello prodigy at the age of 6, I guarantee you that kids spent 1,000 hours on the cello already, which seems crazy for a 6-year-old to be that interested in a cello.
Right.
But like there are kids.
I think that's the biggest thing is like keeping interest.
Yeah. So
right? Like,
as a little kid, because you're supposed to be like experiencing everything, but some kids just like, I want this one thing. Like this just makes sense to me. But they're putting in the time.
Yeah, and they're often not living very balanced lives.
No, and sometimes their parents are maybe supporting that, you know, in ways that aren't healthy, and sometimes they are. I don't know. Expectations, right? Well, narcissistic extension, right? Like my success as a parent is determined upon how well my child does. That's a hard thing not to fall into.
Totally.
So there's one of those tangents which I enjoy.
Yes, and we probably should get back to work.
Yeah, so back to work, you call it. So the fourth noble truth is the path. And so I enjoy this about Eastern philosophy. Tends to be more circular. So like they think of like the dragon chasing its own tail. So the path is really just a restatement of the third noble truth, which is lowering our expectations leads to less suffering. You're saying it a second time because you could like be at home listening and be like, oh yeah, Ulland and Jo, like they make a good point. Like I'm making that decision. I'm going to lower my expectations. That's not a one-time decision. So in a mindful way, what we're saying is this is a process. So you can either be on the path or off the path. So at any given time you have awareness, you could think like, oh, yeah, I think my expectations are high. You have a choice or a chance to lower them, being mindful. Or you can have high expectations or increase your expectations without awareness. But it becomes a decision that you have to work at over and over again. And that's the mindfulness of like, do I have shoulds? I'm a decent enough parent. My child shouldn't be in treatment. But it might not really have much to do with what's been going on in life is complicated. Like it not like because you're a great parent, your child shouldn't have problems. Like the universe does what it does, and your child is a unique individual, and you're a unique individual. Things happen.
Right.
They can't, yeah.
I think of the path as like turning the mind.
Oh yeah.
It's like recognizing that, oh, I'm off the path. I have to get back on the path. I choose to get back on the path. I don't have to. I choose to.
I choose to.
Yeah.
And often being on the path is difficult.
And I think, for me, if you look back on your life and you reflect, there's different areas or different arenas in your life where all of this starts to apply. And I think for me, over the past couple of years, working at the intense level that we work, I had expectations of what my residents will look like when they leave.
Yeah.
And sometimes they aren't there, and that I have to get back into this. Like, okay, it's still a success. Like,
yeah.
Like lowering that expectation of like, oh, all of them are going to leave and, be self-harm free and go to college and, or the family system is like so repaired. And
there'll be no more conflict.
There's no more conflict.
It's June Cleaver and Wally and everybody.
Exactly. And sometimes you get lucky, I don't know, or you work hard or circumstances are right, or lots of repetition, lots of effort. You make significant changes in individuals and their environment, or you help them, I should say. But I think that was a really eye-opening thing for me when like having to maybe discharge someone a little bit early, or we lose them because insurance denies or something like that, to be able to radically accept, well, we got where we got. It's better than we were where we started. It doesn't look like what I hoped it would look like. And recognizing how much hard work has gone in and like what seeds you've planted and, the work that was actually done and achieved. And that to me kind of encompasses like what we're talking about here, like lowering that attachment to what you want them to look like or what they want to look like when they leave. And then, the allowing them to leave wherever they're at, is easier then, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's true. And I think like also it's to go meta to that too. So we're talking about process and outcome. DBT really, we do a lot of assessment measure things, and I think DBT is kind of built on that with how Linehan was smart to go about looking for data and information and really analyze what she's doing. And you have to take it seriously when working with complex patients like she chose to work with. But this idea that it's more process-oriented. You're teaching people to live with a process where they can be more effective regardless of how intensely they feel emotions or how difficult things happen for them in life. If you focus on that process, they're generally going to have better outcomes in general.
Exactly.
And they have a process to follow, not like, oh, you no longer have social anxiety because you did exposures. Well, that's nice, but like, what if it comes back again? But with DBT, it's like, I have social anxiety, and you can be effective in spite of having it.
Right.
And probably if you're effective in spite of having it, it will lower over time.
Yeah.
Yet does it really matter in a sense that you can be effective in social situations regardless of how you feel?
Right.
I think in many ways I'd be okay, like, if I could just be effective regardless of the emotion. Like, I don't want to get rid of the emotion necessarily, but I'd be like seeing a therapist because I have this thing I have a hard time doing. If you can teach me how to do this in spite of how difficult it is, that's really where I want to be at.
Right.
Because what I choose to do in my behavior is what's really important ultimately, not always how I feel about things.
Right.
That's my own experience, but I need to be able to interact with the world and be effective.
Right. For your own personal goals, not expectations.
Right. So things get heavier when we kind of start looking at maybe from a Western perspective. So part of what I also enjoy about dialectical behavior therapy is some of the assumptions and agreements are also out of Stoic philosophy. And at some point we'll, in the podcast, talk about these, but one of the assumptions in DBT is that, people don't cause all the problems in their own life, and it's their responsibility to solve them. It's a very deeply Stoic philosophy. And one of the the first Stoic philosopher was a gentleman by the name of Epictetus, and he was concerned with the idea of suffering, which Stoic philosophy has a lot to do with that. And I think he knew too. So I might have some of the details not fully down because I read this a while ago. But he was a slave living in Greece. I think he had like gout and a club foot, was known to be pretty unattractive, unappealing, older, like blind in one eye or both eyes. So basically not like a great life for a culture that was definitely focused on young male beauty and being free. So I think that Epictetus knew something about suffering. He had said a thing I think is very cool when you talk about expectations. To paraphrase him, he had this idea that I have a dream for life to be as it is. It's like he didn't dream to be some fancy person or wealthy or to even be free. It was like, my life is how I've always dreamed it to be. There are no expectations when you work to believing that and being okay with that. Life is hard enough, but there's not this additional disappointment of not being further than you are. And it doesn't mean you can't work for something more.
Mm-hmm. It's not passive. Like, I think people will hear that quote and think of it as passive. Really what it is, it's just acceptance. It's like the ability to accept my life as it is right now in this moment in time.
I'm doing what I can do. I'm working towards a goal. I want to be a certain way at some point maybe, and how I am right now is okay.
Yep.
Yeah, it's ultimate acceptance, I think. It says something even harder that talking with families is very difficult to do. I call it the challenge. I don't know if anybody else calls it that, but he had made a suggestion that I think is really hard to do. And the suggestion for him was go into your child's room at night when they're sleeping and kiss them on the forehead. But when you're kissing them on the forehead, you're trying to imagine them like that they're dead, like that's their corpse. And in his time and place, that would be extremely hard to do because actually that would be likely to happen during those times because of what we talked about before with the law of twos, is that was a commonplace thing to have happen. So this challenge made a lot of sense during his time and it would be hard to do in this time. And they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have photo albums, or you didn't have like a bust of your children made, like unless you were like uber wealthy and you were like a Caesar, right? So you had no physical reminder of what your child even looked like. So the intensity of him saying you go into the room to kiss him last time is that's the last time you get to see them, and everything else is memory from then on out. Like that's just a type of loss for any parent, but then just incredible amount of loss. So, and he's asking you to basically visualize this as you're doing it. And I've done it a couple times, and it's really, really difficult to do. And the experience I had that weekend was I was far more aware of my sons, like their tone of voice, their body posture, what they're doing. I was noticing all kinds of things about them I hadn't really been aware of before as them as individuals. And I wasn't having thoughts about how they're in school, where their futures are, anything. It was really like in the moment, just my kids being themselves and seeing all kinds of small details I'd never really thought about before. So I think this is something helpful because it kind of like resets things. Like as parents, we have a lot of worries or thoughts about other things that, come from maybe culture, society, or our own wants, needs, and desires for our children, while forgetting we are human beings who are born dying. I mean, to be honest, that's a really hard thing to talk about, but we're fighting death the moment we're born because entropy is trying to pull us into, having no potential and not existing. And we're fighting that our whole life. And that's a morbid thing to think about when you have your children running around. However, comparing and contrasting the idea, like we talked about earlier, is like the compare and contrast between living and dead can help you really appreciate the fact that you're here right now in this moment, you're alive and you're with someone. Mm-hmm. And I think it's hard because nobody guaranteed that our children would outlive us. And that's a pretty disturbing thought for a parent. A natural order, things as I get old, I'll pass away, my children have to deal with my death, but they'll be older and able to handle it, ideally, and that may not be true. Mm-hmm. And there's no way in my mind I want to come to terms with the fact that I would be at my own child's funeral. Right.
Well, and I think, just keeping in mind our listeners out there, I think that it can be anyone that you love. So not everybody out there is going to have children, but, if you have someone that you love, you can imagine the same thing. I tend to do this when I'm experiencing irritation. So like my youngest daughter and I will sometimes clash a bit. And then I think to myself, and she's alive and she is here and she is this amazing, dynamic little human being. Yeah. And I can't imagine, so I think it's a call to mindfulness of prioritizing, like what is actually important right now in this moment. Is it connection or is it being right? Mm-hmm. She's going to be 13 soon. So there's days I just want to be right and I want her to be quiet, but
yeah, good luck.
Yeah. And that's not going to happen. So, it just does. I think it just does prioritize things when we're feeling disconnected.
And so I think that's also true with, just to clarify, with the challenge that Epictetus set out was really to guide you to what's important, which is really the connection you have with someone here and now and in that moment. It makes things very real and very mindful. Mm-hmm. One more piece of Stoic philosophy, and this quote is taken from the Daily Stoic, which is a nice book that talks about a Stoic principle, every day, and you kind of follow like a journal or a diary. The Stoics are often stereotyped as suppressing their emotions, but their philosophy was actually intended to teach us to face, process, and deal with emotions immediately instead of running from them. Tempting as it is to deceive yourself or hide from a powerful emotion like grief, by telling yourself and other people that you're fine, awareness and understanding are better. Distraction might be pleasant in the short term, focus is better for the long term.
I like that quote a lot.
And that's kind of actually a lot of the everyday working with residents is doing that.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much avoidance of emotion in the world in general, and a lot of residents are also avoidant of sadness in particular.
Inhibited grieving.
Yes, inhibited grieving, which we'll likely discuss in another podcast. So this has been All Therapists Are Jerks. Thank you for joining us.